And we are
Hello.
live! Greetings, salutations, and welcome for a very special episode with a very special guest. Yes, today we are unpacking historical fantasy. It's one of my favorite genres. And who do we have here? We have the ever incredible Chloe Gong. Chloe, how are you doing today?
I am good. Thank you for having me. I was ready to expect explosions, but that was better than I could have imagined.
Yeah, I just was. Chloe was saying explosions. What are these explosions you're telling me about? And I was like, yeah, here at World Ample, we like, epic explosions and warm hugs is kind of how we roll.
I was
Here at
very
World Ample.
excited, and you
Yeah,
delivered in
that's,
spades.
that's how we do. That's how we do.
Yeah.
Yeah, so historical fantasy. I am very excited about this. My very first novel was historical fantasy. Chloe Gong has turned it into an art form. And let me introduce her properly because she is far too modest to introduce herself. Chloe Gong is a number one, yes, number one New York Times best-selling author of the critically acclaimed Secret Shanghai novels. By the way, set in 1920s Shanghai, super
Mhm.
relevant for what we're talking about today, as well as the Flash and False Gods trilogy. Her books have been published in over 20 countries and have been featured in the New York Times, People, Cosmopolitan, and more. She was named one of Forbes 30 under 30 for 2024. That's this year, if you can't keep track. Neither can I. It's cool. Chloe graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a degree in English and International Relations. She was born in Shanghai and raised in Auckland, New Zealand, and is now located in New York City, pretending to be a real adult. Don't pretend too hard, Chloe. It's not worth it.
Yeah,
Don't do
it
it.
really isn't.
Not worth it. Not worth
Yeah,
it.
I wrote that bio a few years ago, and now I'm like, I don't like this.
Yeah. I given up all pretense, I feel.
Yeah.
Like we were pretending for a while, we don't do that anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Just living your best awesome writer life. I adore
Mhm.
that. So, I suppose we should start at the beginning with what is historical fantasy? What are your thoughts on this, Chloe? How would you define the genre?
What a big question. I mean,
I know, right?
I feel like there are several branches to historical fantasy. I think recently, as historical fantasy is being published, we're never quite sure what they mean by that until the book blurb comes in front of us, because sometimes it means historical set fantasy, right? It means it actually is set in a real time. There's just some element of magic or some element, some like speculative facet of the story. And then other times I have noticed publishers also use historical fantasy when they just mean vaguely inspired by. Like, I think sometimes people call Bridgerton historical fantasy just because it's
Right.
like alternate time. It really isn't drawing from the actual period. It just has the vibes and it tells a
Yeah.
story, and therefore it's historical fantasy. So it's it's so wide. It could truly mean anything as long as it has some element of the past in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the big things here is that historical fantasy covers both. It's the first world, it's this Earth, but there's
Hmm.
fantasy shenanigans going on, and it's in the past. But it also
Hmm.
covers its second world. It's a completely it's Westeros. It's Middle
Mm.
Earth, but it's a medieval technology level or a steampunk technology level. That
Mhm.
still also counts as historical fantasy, even though it's not actually historical. And then there's the third category that you mentioned, which is kind of it's not really fantasy, but they're calling it
It's just
it's like
vibes.
it's like a fantasy on history,
Yes.
maybe. But
Yes,
like
yes.
there ain't no werewolves in Bridgerton. I kind of wish there were werewolves in Bridgerton. Would
That
we
would
watch
be
that?
really
We would watch
fun.
that.
That would be
Honestly,
really
Gail
fun,
Carriger
actually.
Gail Carriger kind of wrote that and it's awesome. Um,
Mm. Mhm.
right? It's kind of
Mhm.
like
Yeah.
steampunky, werewolves, vampires vibes. Like that
Yeah.
exists. It's out
Mhm.
there. But I would say for me anyway, uh Bridgerton is not for me historical fantasy. It's like a fantasia on history.
Mhm.
It's definitely like alt Earth for sure.
Mhm.
Um, but then, once the werewolves come, once it's vampires, or it's a secret world, or it's okay, it's an alternate Earth where these things are out and
Mhm.
proud. For me, then it becomes historical fantasy. For me,
I
like that's where
agree.
my lines
Yeah,
are.
I agree. I think for me, it's the first instance that counts as historical fantasy. I think we need to be working within the bounds of history as we know it in order to call it historical fantasy. I would even go as far to say secondary world fantasy could be historical fantasy depending on how much inspiration is drawn from it.
Mm,
But for example, my adult fantasy series, I don't call it historical fantasy, even though I was very much inspired by like this mashup between 1990s Hong Kong and the Roman Empire. Like to me, because there are so many elements of invention, I just call it fantasy because I think when you say something is historical, historical fans go in expecting something. And
Right.
usually that is some sort of, you're adhering to what you imagine when you think of the time. Um, so if it's like a bit too much of a mashup, if there's a bit too much invention, I would just call it fantasy.
Yeah. No, I
Yeah.
think that's totally fair. And I think that your point too, it can be, such and such inspired, like medieval
Yeah.
inspired fantasy for Game of
Mhm.
Thrones, which is
Mhm.
literally a retelling of the War of the Roses, for
Right.
example.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. But with dragons. To be fair, that's
Yeah.
what historical England has been missing, honestly. It's freaking dragons.
You're so right.
What can I say? Like all of those
Yeah.
things, add some dragons, and I'm learning that. That's happening.
I feel like that goes for like every historical series. It's like, you know what this needs? Dragons.
Yes.
Or
If in doubt,
creatures.
yeah, if
Yeah.
in doubt, dragons.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I
It's
like
why I
it.
love Pride and Prejudice and Zombies so much. I love it more than
Yes.
Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah. For me, the movie it's one of the few instances that the movie outdid the book for me.
Mm,
I I
that's fair.
I don't might be a spicy opinion, but for me, the movie won the book in that scenario, and that was very
Mhm.
surprising. But I did enjoy them both.
Mhm.
Very silly, very silly. All right, so obviously we're both massive historical fantasy fans. What for you is the draw? What do you love about it?
Mhm. I think I'm a history nerd. I still remember my first drafts when we were working, well, not my first drafts. It was like my third, fourth draft, but my first draft with my agent. We were working through it, doing edits before submitting it to publishers, and she had to comment in the sidebar and go, Chloe, you have to remember this is a novel, not a historical textbook. We do need to pull back a little bit. And I had to be like, I know, but it's so fascinating to me. And, in reality, it was just me describing like a battalion of soldiers walking through their route. And it was so boring. It was so mundane. But to me, I was like, I did all the work to find this out, to map out their path. You mean to tell me I can't incorporate it into the story? Um, to be fair, I did figure out ways to incorporate what I really, really needed to work in there. But when it came to the facts, the details, the dates and times, ultimately I had to serve the narrative. But I think on a larger scale, I'm just so fascinated by history. I'm so fascinated by the stories that truly existed in our real past, and I wanted to make something out of it. I knew that when I was writing These Violent Delights, my debut, that it was the real history of gangsters overtaking 1920 Shanghai that I wanted to work with. It wouldn't feel the same if I had just drawn inspiration from it and done a whole tale of gangsters myself, because why would I when history was so much more interesting?
I think that's such a good point, and there are so many when you dig into the footnotes and the bits and pieces of history, there are so many amazing things. And when you can imagine the people in those situations, very often
Hmm.
you feel like, well, I can't really do anything. The story has just written
Exactly.
itself.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes history is like it's more interesting than anything we could have made up, and why not work with that?
Yes, and also weirder. I'm going to
Oh
skip
yeah.
ahead and say, so after this, we have a premiere of a video about the Tiffany problem, which TLDR is when something in history doesn't seem like it's authentic, even though it is. So the
Mm,
name Tiffany is a really common example of this. I go through a bunch of examples in the video and a bunch of kind of things to think about and ways to get around it. But essentially, Romans having vending machines is another one. They did. We know this. If you put it in a book, everybody would be like, "This is crazy.
yeah.
Why do these robots have vending machines? What is wrong with this author? What has she been like? What toads has she been licking?" Um,
Mhm.
have you come across this in your own research and work?
Mhm.
Is this something that you found where you're like, well, I can't put this in. It's too weird. Nobody would believe it.
Well, okay, the funny thing is I've been adjacent to the Tiffany problem, and it's stuff that I did have to work with ultimately because it was a part of the setting. When writing anything set in 1920s Shanghai, I think a common misconception among people nowadays is how globalized the world already was back then. So a lot of the research that I did about 1920 Shanghai portrayed it effectively like 1920s New York because it was a visa-free port. People from all over the world were flooding to Shanghai at that time. You know, there were immigrants from Russia, from Europe who were escaping prosecution at that time. There were Americans, British people coming in because it was this booming commercial place. And it also meant most elite Chinese people at that time had English names. And so when we come to the Tiffany problem, I had a lot of people try to combat the world I'd built and said, why does everyone have an English name? Like why are we like lazying out of this? And I was like, I'm so sorry to tell you this, but it's because of colonization. Like there were actually people that took on all these English names because that was how they had to deal with business at the time. That was how they dealt with the Americans, the British people. And so some of the most, famous socialites of 1920 Shanghai were named Tiffany, Evelyn, things like that, right? So I really just had to sit with that. I had to sit with, am I telling a story that is true to the 1920 Shanghai I'm trying to portray? Or am I telling a story true to what readers think 1920 Shanghai could have been because of media, because of stereotypes, like in other movies made by, the West? And ultimately, I was thinking, if there really were people that had these names, that's the names they're gonna have. It's just, and that's history. I'm so sorry.
And it really is one of those moments where like perception and reception history meets actual history, and you have to
Yes.
make a choice, you have to make a call. And again, like if you're in a second world, you can say, okay, I'll do it like the expected way. But I feel
Mhm.
like, I don't know, for me as a writer, it would be a misrepresentation of the nuances of the actual world to
Absolutely.
represent it other than it is. Like it
Mhm.
takes something away, I think.
Absolutely. I think that's what makes historical fantasy so beautiful, right? It's like it's so wide, it's so varying, and the stories that you tell come from something that you are drawing from, and to minimize it and make it, okay, this is the expectation, takes away from what the genre should and can be.
Yeah, I totally agree. So that brings us smoothly onto the research question. And
Mm.
this is something that can be overwhelming sometimes. Why is it so important for historical fantasy? And what should we be focusing on as writers? Where should we put our research goggles?
Mm.
And what can we safely not look
Mhm.
at to prevent overwhelm?
I don't know if I'm in the minority for this, but I personally love the research for historical fantasy, right? Yeah. I feel like that's what makes us historical fantasy like lovers. There's just something I think fun to me to be doing the research and to be drawing from it for the story because I don't know, having written a historical fantasy series and then a series inspired by history, I feel like doing that research, it has the pros and cons, right? Like doing the research gives you guidelines. It kind of gives you the skeleton that you can be working from when you are building your plot, as opposed to when it is just the inspiration and you can toss aside things that don't necessarily work for you. It gives you that room to play with and you have the invention element of it. So when I am writing historical fantasy, I feel like not getting too invent stuff is a good thing. It's something that I find um, a nice challenge. I sort of sit there and I think, okay, I'm gonna draw out the timeline of the Chinese Civil War, and now my challenge is to fit my plot into this in a way that supports what was going on and actually adds to the atmosphere of the time rather than combating against it. But that is it's a huge task, right? You need to decide how much research you're doing before you start, how much research you're going to do as you're going on, because otherwise, like I think a lot of like historical writers meet this you meet this kind of like paralyzation when you're starting. You're not sure how much you actually should know before you go in, how much you should go in with. Um, But I feel like you need to know enough in order to build the world that you are working from. But then otherwise, you can toss aside the things that you can add in at a later point. You don't need to know everything going in. You need to know however much you know in order to tell the story that you need to at the point, at that moment. But otherwise, I think there are many readers who kind of sit there researching forever, and then that book never gets written. But the most important thing is to write that book, and then the details can come in.
Yeah, I totally agree. Absolutely. And I think that you can't you can't show fear to the research. You can't let it smell
Yeah.
your fear. You know what I mean?
It's like a printer. It doesn't work if you show your fair.
Yeah, exactly.
You've
That's
got
a
to hit,
great
yeah.
you got to take it head on. And I think that just being aware that you will never know everything, that
Mm,
there are specialists that you can send this to who will flag stuff, and then you can decide if
mhm,
that is important or not for your story.
mm.
So my mother is an archaeologist, and I sometimes watch historical movies with her, and the commentary
Um.
of that hairstyle is not Roman. Why is she wearing those shoes? Nobody would say anything like that.
Yeah.
That's completely wrong. That's in a
Yep,
completely
yep.
different city. These ruins are actually from this time. They're medieval,
Mhm.
blah 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 blah.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
it is important. It is. I love my mother. She's a freaking guest on the podcast. Very interesting lady. But yeah, she is wonderful, but she is an ultimate specialist. She is like one of the
Mm,
most highly trained specialists in her
mhm.
field. Of course she knows these things.
Yeah.
And I think, accepting that there is a little bit of wiggle room, there is a margin for error. It's about
Mhm,
the spirit of the time, although you try and get things
mhm.
right, I think is also, if nothing else, it's something that you have to tell yourself when you're going in.
Absolutely. It's why I include an author's note at the end of all of my historical fantasy series, where I'm like, I truly did my best to capture the environment and the atmosphere. However, this is ultimately a work of fiction. I think novelists need to understand that, where we are going in to tell a story. We actually aren't here to pick apart the history and to be a specialist. I think it's so valuable in drawing that inspiration and consulting your sources and doing all of that. But ultimately, it is the story that matters. And we also have to remember that you can do your absolute best with details, right? Those are the non negotiables. But when it comes to things like people's thoughts, people's opinions, things happening, we have to remember that history doesn't actually get recorded to like the complete T. Some things may happen that we'll never know about. Some things also are not a monolith. I think about how you could stop and interview a random person on the street and they would have two completely different opinions about our politicians, about our public figures, about what they think in this current global climate. And it's the exact same for anyone living in the 1920s. There's no way to say everyone believed this or everyone thought this.
Yeah, absolutely. Or even everyone knows this. Like if TikTok
Mm,
has taught me nothing, it's taught me that when you
yes.
interview random people, they have
Oh,
wild beliefs about actual factual information in the world. Like
yeah.
where mountains are or the names of things. We're not even talking about opinions, which are even more varied. We're talking about actual facts in
Mm-hmm.
our world.
Yep.
That's now in the age of information. Imagine how
Mm-hmm.
it was in the past, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. We know so much about everyone now, and clearly, when we watch the TikTok interviews, people still don't know what the capital of the United States is. So, like,
Yeah, exactly. And do you know what? As now, so then. And there are a lot of these kinds of human truths I think
mhm,
you can eke back and say, this is a
mhm,
very human thing. I would imagine humans were humaning in this way back then as well and had these same
absolutely,
foibles, right?
absolutely.
That actually gets me onto a really interesting question that
Mm,
is often a tricky one in historical fantasy. You're dealing with
mm,
a different a different culture necessarily because it's a different time
mhm,
period with different social taboos, different mores, different beliefs, different
mm,
understandings of things like gender roles or, how old
mhm,
is old and this kind of thing.
mhm,
Um, how do you go about capturing historical mentalities for your characters and where are the lines for you? Because there may
mm,
be some historically accurate opinions
mhm,
and beliefs that we don't necessarily want to
Mhm.
perpetuate in our stories. So,
Mhm.
how have you handled that kind of space in historical fantasy?
Mhm. This is such a great question because I feel like it's something like historical writers have to think about this where although we are writing about history, we are writing for readers today. And I think that distinguishing factor can steer your hand toward capturing opinions and beliefs that probably feel more modern than were actually, existing at the time. But nonetheless, there were definitely those opinions in existence, right? As long as it's not so out of the left field that it's like, some lady in Tudor England who absolutely believes in like, I don't know, like fourth wave feminism. Like, as long as there is that existing structure behind it, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to portray it a bit more, you know, predominantly than really it was in existence. Um, I think when I was thinking about 1920 Shanghai, I was fortunate that, the 1920s wasn't too long ago, at least not to a point where it feels foreign to us today. Like it's only been 100 years, and we are kind of at a point in the modern day society that we are cycling back to a lot of these ideas. Um, it's unfortunate. I think it happens in economic cycles, right? Like suddenly there's all the xenophobia about like, oh, I feel unsafe in my current role because there are all these people coming in and taking these things from me. And actually, it's just because we're entering a recession. It happens. History is in a cycle. And so I think I wanted to write characters that felt like spoke to teenagers today when it came to my YA historical fantasy series. I wanted characters who were entering that 20s age of like liberation and I don't need a man, I can beat people up myself because it did exist. It was definitely a minority opinion, and it was definitely an opinion that mostly existed among the elite. And so I think, as long as readers are also remembering that these characters cannot capture the entire monolithic culture of that period, you understand that each character represents themselves at that time. And that needs to be enough. It can't speak for everyone, it can't speak for your entire culture. And characters can also have very opposing viewpoints that don't necessarily reflect the author's viewpoint, right? Like, I think we are also at a time where authors sometimes feel the need to have a character say a bad thing and then quickly go, and that was wrong, of course. Here's why. But it's a work of fiction. It's a work of exploring a character going through character arcs and learning and growing. And characters are allowed to believe in, what we now term problematic beliefs, as long as they're challenged later, maybe by more characters, maybe by their growth. It doesn't have to be immediately combated by the narrative, which I think a lot of us now, like in this modern society, are like, okay, but let's be sure what's right and wrong, because that's a slippery slope in fiction.
Yeah, I totally agree. On the other side of this question, I was at this wonderful panel during Worldcon, about female leads who don't kick ass. And the
Mm,
very wonderful Juliet E. McKenna, who is trained as a classicist, but is also a very fine author, brought up the fact that, there are sometimes these, in medieval inspired or leaning into the medieval element
mm,
of fantasy. There are female characters who try to, stand up and buck the patriarchy and create a safe space, or like mighty women movement, which is
uh-huh.
amazing.
Right.
But her point was, yeah, if anybody did this in the actual medieval period, they would be burnt. They would just be burnt at
Mhm,
the stake. It's not just about them and their mentalities, it's also about the the way society understands this at large and the way that
mhm,
society moves. And I think that the bigger the ripples you make and the more you want to
mhm,
start a movement, as opposed to, I'm just a lady that kicks ass. I don't need no man to kick my ass. I could do it on my own. The more you want to turn that into a movement and an organization, the more you face those kinds of historical
mhm.
mentalities that might push back and cause you issues, essentially.
Absolutely. Especially when it comes to medieval time periods too, like the further back we go, to insert the modern definition of kick ass as the ultimate like feminist move is also sometimes very infantilizing to the actual women of that time, because there were absolutely strong women who were finding their own ways to feel fulfilled, to like combat against that societal institution without picking up a sword, right? There are people who taught themselves how to read, who to sew, all of that. And there is an existing structure in the society to prove them strong. It doesn't have to be our modern definition.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Funny enough, I was having a conversation with someone else about this, and one of the things we both kind of honed into was things like religious structures. Nuns like
Mm,
Hildegard von Bingen, who was a major thought leader of the 12th and 13th century in Berlin. Sorry, in
mm,
Germany. These were really strong women who essentially
mhm,
created their own base of education, their own base of female power, but they did it in a very not kicking ass way. They did it in a
mm,
wimple, right? Like
yep.
it's just another way of
Yes.
creating power and creating spaces where
Mm,
women can have agency, essentially.
mhm, absolutely.
Yeah, I could talk about this all day, but we
Yeah.
probably shouldn't move on. Um, let's talk about what makes a great time period or location for a historical fantasy novel. I would imagine at this point during the podcast, people are sitting there thinking, this sounds fun. I want to play with this. What makes a really good time and
Mm.
place to set a historical fantasy story?
I feel like it truly comes down to the individual author. I think the best historical fantasy novel is the one where you can feel that the author had so much fun doing that research. It's the one where you can feel that the author had some sort of tie to the place and a fascination with what was going on and some sort of link, that they wanted to explore this. I don't think I would have stumbled onto 1920s Shanghai if it weren't for the fact that both my parents grew up there, are from there. Everyone before them were from there. And it means there were a lot of family stories that were passed down, especially about the 1920s, because it was this golden age for the city. It was between the world wars. It was this time of like booming capitalism, and everyone felt like they had like a piece of that machine, right? And it felt like you were being remembered in history. And so, of course, in the modern day now, the stories that come from it feel like there is something there to work with. Um, and so for me, it was kind of this ever moving process of like reconnecting with everyone who came before me in a way that I didn't experience myself because my parents immigrated with me when I was 2. I only know of Shanghai as this place that we visit when we go back to see our relatives. And doing the research process, doing this kind of look into all these decades back, to me felt like I was in touch with what was happening before me. It felt like I was really, I guess, getting another look into these stories that I've always grown up with. And so I hope that people can feel it when they are reading the setting. They can feel the kinds of, I guess, questions that I've asked of my relatives. They can feel the narratives that I am most interested in when it comes to the locals at the time and how they were interacting with society around them. And so, historical anything to me is the level of fascination that author has with that time period and whether or not it's that story that they should be telling. I think there are a lot of time periods too where I'm sitting there thinking, that is so fascinating. I would love to hear from an author who has some sort of experience with this, because that's what makes great storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think passion is so key. As we both were saying earlier, you're going to be spending a lot of time doing some research on this place. You better be excited about it. You
Oh,
better
yeah.
care. And you're going to be looking at these streets through the eyes of your characters. You're going to be exploring this
Mhm.
place like something that you care about. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Are there
Mhm.
any other things that you think make good fantasy novels? Should there be big history happening there? Is it better if there isn't big history happening there?
Mm.
What are your thoughts?
I feel like it comes down to the story that you wanna tell. I think I, like a lot of people, am fascinated by, like, the rise of the Roman Empire, right? Because there's
Mm,
something so fascinating about, like, that was the start of, like, Western society as we know it. Like, I have been fascinated with the Battle of Actium since I was, like,
mm,
16 because I was like, "What if Antony and Cleopatra hadn't lost it? Would the Roman Empire have started? Would the rest of the world have then, gone down a very different path?" It's those kinds of like what ifs that I think draw a lot of great stories and tend to lead a lot of historical fantasy to focus around big time periods, the
Yeah.
wars, the battles. There's a reason why there's so much World War One and World War Two historical fantasy as well. Um, so I think it comes down to the story that someone is fascinated by. I think if you want to tell the epics, of course, the big battles are fascinating. If you want to tell the more day-to-day lives, you could pick a time period that has always just seemed interesting to you and go into it, even if it was like decades of peace. There's so much story in that as well. Um, yeah, I don't know if I answered that with anything other than it depends.
No, no, I think so, and I think that the big takeaway there is absolutely what kind of narrative are you trying to tell? Because if you're trying to tell
Mm,
a cute coffee shop narrative
exactly.
and, there's some mass destruction going on right
Mm-hmm.
next to your coffee shop, that's going to be hard. One
Exactly.
of the things, going back to Bridgerton, one of the things that
Mm.
bugged me about the first season of Bridgerton, and I love Bridgerton, I'm not a Bridgerton hater, but one of the things that bugged me is this amazing, like, the grand experiment that they really dig into later. Nobody was talking about it, and I was like, "That is the most interesting thing about this setting, and no one is talking about it, and that's the only thing I have questions
Mhm.
about." I'm thrilled that this lady is kissing that man. I hope they have fun, but really, why are we not talking about the super
Yeah.
interesting in the setting that I felt kind of overshadowed season 1? Because I was
Mhm.
like, "This is all great, but I wanna know about that," and nobody's talking about that.
I
If
feel yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. I feel the exact same way. I This is why I think it's so important to pick the time period that fits the story you are trying to tell, because I think I was very frustrated as a teen reader when I was picking up stories set in the 1920s, and the focus was the glitz, it was the glamour, it was the aesthetics, and I was like, what about the imperialism? Like, there's so much going on at that time that it almost feels lazy to have a character move through the world and not acknowledge what else is going on. And so, if someone wants to tell a story with very specific themes in mind, it has to be selected right.
Yeah, absolutely. Funnily enough, another author that comes to mind in that is Jane Austen, who literally writes like
Mm,
obviously she wasn't writing history, she was writing
right.
present day,
Mm-hmm.
but she was writing these stories of these, men and women getting together, falling in love, having terrible mothers,
Mm-hmm.
all of this kind of stuff, not having quite enough money for fabric for a new dress.
Mm-hmm.
All the time, her actual brothers were in the navy, off doing a colonial. Never comes into the books, never relevant, because she's drawn the line at the end of the
Mm,
parlor and said, "This is the world I'm talking about." In many
mm-hmm.
ways, it's very
Yep.
odd to read them as a modern reader and know all of that stuff was going on, and she just it. You never see outside the little village. You never see outside,
Mm,
the streets of Bath and the new tea that has
yeah.
come in. It's very
Yeah. Yeah.
odd.
Yeah, it is also very drawn out. Like, she definitely did that in setting the boundaries for her world, which is interesting.
Yeah, yeah, like, she decided what was important. She set her on whatever
Mhm,
we call them focus points. She was like, "These are my focus
mhm.
points. These are the
Yep.
things I care about. I care about
And
fashion,
everything else,
romance,
forget it. Yeah.
music, tea, colonialism. No, we're not talking about
Yep.
that. No, darling."
Mhm,
But yeah, absolutely, and I suppose that's another way to approach this, is just to
mhm.
say, "Okay, but this is where my world stops. That's what I'm
Yep.
interested in."
Yeah.
But
And
yeah.
honestly, I can respect that. Like, if people really wanna draw the lines down there, I respect that.
Yeah, absolutely. I
Yeah.
mean, the proof is in the paper, right? If it works.
Mhm. It works.
All right. So we talked about what does work. Let's talk about what
Mm.
we should maybe avoid. So time
Mhm,
periods or
mhm.
locations that you would recommend to avoid as a setting for a
Mm.
historical fantasy novel.
Mhm. I feel like there's nothing in particular that I feel like is a hard and fast rule to avoid. In the same way as like there's nothing particular about what definitely does work, right? I think there's always so much discourse, most definitely recent discourse too, where, in coming years, well, with diversified fantasy, with diversified literature, there has been an emphasis on like telling the stories that are yours to tell, about not stepping into a path where, you know you're just so fascinated as like a bystander that you're like, yes, let me tell the story that has nothing to do with me culturally whatsoever. But the thing is, like, I think many people have different opinions about this, but where I come from is that there is no such thing as a story you definitely cannot tell. There's just, you need to really ask yourself and be honest with yourself why you want to tell it, right? I think we've got this recent syndrome of like, oh, I can't write these characters. They're completely different to me. But, isn't it worse to write characters that only ever think like you? And on the flip side, there are people who really believe that should not be done at all. But I don't know. I think about how there's been that recent adaptation of Shogun, which I'm pretty
Mm,
sure was already a book and written by
yeah,
a white man. I'm pretty
yeah,
sure.
that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
And it's like, it's just constantly up for debate whether or not some stories are yours to tell. There will be people who believe it is not. There will be people who value the idea of bringing that story into culture, who value the fact that it is now turned into a television series where Asian actors can go in and have their time in the limelight, right? Like, it is never just a black and white matter about what stories are someone's to tell. It is so nuanced, and I think personal opinion ends up really coloring it at the end of the day. But for an author who is sitting there thinking, like, what is mine to tell, that truly is something they can work out for themselves. It's thinking about whether there are already stories that exist from people who might be like closer connected to the culture, whether there are no stories at all and you would be taking a first from someone. It's those questions. But no one can tell you that you can't do anything, of course.
Yeah. No, that's great. Thank you. Let's move on to common mistakes. I often ask this question because not because I'm shady. I don't want to throw shade. I'm not asking you to name names. But I feel like as writers who've worked in historical fantasy already, particularly you who've written so successfully and so many books in historical fantasy, maybe you can share some like, don't do this. I have seen so much of this, or don't do this. I made this terrible mistake. You don't need to do this. I have done it for you. I can tell you it doesn't work. Are there any things like that, either in terms of craft or in terms of, final
Mhm.
books that you would say, watch out for this particular pitfall?
Mhm. I love this question. I love being slightly shady. I can't really think of specific examples. I think it's because I like to think of myself as a pretty generous reader, honestly. Like, I don't know if it's because I've been writing for so long, but when I do go into a book and I kind of shut off my writer brain. I'm like, I'm just here to have a good time. So I do think of myself as a generous reader. That being said, I think one of my biggest pet peeves in historical fantasy is when there are terms of a different language of some sort woven in, but then it does double duty because the English is then used to explain it as well. And I think this is another personal opinion. I think some people like it, some people don't like it. But to me, it feels like it takes it kind of ruins my suspension of disbelief for a
Yeah.
second because the book is being presented to me in English, but I, for most times, have to believe they're speaking whatever language they are in the book, or they're speaking some other like fantasy language. And so I have to imagine if you do it twice, it just doesn't make sense anymore, right? There's the term that you have used in order to put us into that world, but then if it's explained again, it's essentially happened twice in the span of the narrative. And that gets to me. I think it's because I work in a time period where language is so important. I really had to pay attention to points where characters were thinking, now I need to switch languages because this person only understands this person only speaks this, or I need to switch languages now because we can't be seen speaking English here. All of those things made it so that I pay extra attention to like those little you know, when something is happening or not. And so there's the like translation problem. There's also the problem when people pick out, um, not pick out, when it is remarked how something sounds and then it's not true. I still remember a
Mm.
very specific book I read. It was set in history. I think it might have been like just historical as opposed to historical fantasy. But realistically in that world they were speaking a completely different language, and then the narration said those two words like shook me to my core or something like that, and I spoke the other language that they were allegedly writing in, and I was like, that's not two words, more than 2 words, actually, so that's not right. And it's those little things that you probably would not pick out unless you did speak that language and you had a thought of like, "Oh, wait, that doesn't check out." So, yeah, that's all I can think of.
Languages. Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's really important. A lot of writers are monoglots, like they only speak one language.
Mm.
Um, and I think the more languages you speak, the more you confused you get. I'm on 5. It's horrible. Um,
Yeah.
everything means something in a different language.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, also the more sensitive you become to this kind of stuff where, oh, okay, I made a pun, but that's a pun in this language and in
Mm.
the other language it
Mhm.
doesn't make sense. Or this is an idiom in that language, but if you translate it, the idiom is different. Like if
Mhm,
you
mhm.
raining cats and dogs is not what you say in any other language. They have their own idioms for that. In
Yes.
Greece they say raining chairs.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting. I
Yeah.
wonder why.
I don't know, but I don't want to be in that.
Yeah, that would hurt. Well,
Yeah.
cats and dogs too, I suppose. I don't know where that comes from either.
I don't know, but for me, that's like the sound alone, just like meow. That's all I can think of when people say raining cats and dogs. I just hear the noise.
Yeah, yeah. I guess I can see it when it's like the thud, right? It's like the
Yeah,
heavy. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. But I mean, cats. Who's dropping cats? Who's finding this out? I don't know.
I
Anyway,
started
I
imagining
digress. Sorry.
tornadoes. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I led us down a dark path. But yeah, I would agree. Like language and idioms is a
Mhm.
big one. I mean, the obvious one is anachronisms. Like don't
Mm.
don't give your maid a laser pointer. Don't
Yeah.
don't give Jane Austen a toaster. At least not one that has an automatic ping
Right, right.
function. Um,
Unless it's, like, critical to the speculative element you're bringing to it, right? Like, I think it's fascinating when you put, like, zombies into, like, Jane Austen, and therefore there are also, like, vaccines and then, like, needles. I'm like, "Okay, I can buy that, but no
oh yeah.
toasters."
Oh yeah, and that actually works. I mean, in Jane Austen's era,
Mhm.
they already had inoculation and all sorts of other things.
Mhm.
So absolutely, and I think that actually another common mistake in historical fantasy
Mhm.
is unless you have a secret world, your fantasy elements are going to do things to your technology. They're
Mm.
gonna do
Mhm.
things to your culture. You cannot
Mhm.
imagine that you can have vampires and werewolves wandering around in your streets and everything otherwise will be as it was. Like fashion will
Yeah.
change,
Mhm.
culture will change, taboos will change. It's gonna be
Mhm.
different.
This gave me such a headache when I was writing my spin-off historical fantasy series
Mm.
because I had basically put like a Marvel movie into 1930s Shanghai because there were experiments going on where soldiers were being made super strong, invincible, etc. And I think I was sat there for like an hour being like, it doesn't make sense for the coming war, you know? Once you introduce an element like that, the war is going to change because the outcome is not going to be the same again, depending on which side has this technology. And so, like, minor spoiler alert, like, the only way I can solve it was by making that technology go away once I finished using it. Because otherwise, I'm not gonna go impacting the rest of history that then did exist within the confines of
Right.
this world.
Right, because that then raises questions about, oh, is this alternate Earth? Is this like
Exactly.
what's going on?
Exactly.
Like
Yeah.
that's one step removed then from the reader experience. It damages
Mhm.
suspension of disbelief. Yeah, I can totally see that.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so these are just some common mistakes we should try and avoid, I guess, guys. I
Yeah,
hope
not to
that
call
was helpful.
anyone out. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't need to call anyone out. We don't need to
Nope.
be shady.
Nope, nope.
Um, yeah. So Mary Robinette Colwell has famously called historical fantasy the hardest genre to write, and she has written a bunch of historical
Mhm.
fantasy herself. Would you agree with this? And if so, why?
I think I agree to an extent.
Mm,
I agree that it's the hottest genre to write, I think, when it comes to preparation and to following the genre for what it is, right? Like how we started this live stream defining historical fantasy and how we believe it to be something that really fits into history. It supports the historical narrative that we already know. It contributes to the historical atmosphere. It doesn't take us away from what it was, it adds to it. And I think it's such a hard genre when it comes to doing that successfully. Um, but I will say, I think having now written secondary world fantasy as well, I find that harder when it comes to telling a good story, and I think that's because I love history so much. I just feel like I inherently trust that if I'm following history, I'm telling something that is entertaining. Versus when it comes to inventing my own history, I'm like, I'm sitting there bored. I'm sitting there thinking like no one's gonna care. Like, what am I making up? And it was just a lot harder for me to kind of define what was going on. I had to set my own rules because if I didn't, it could be limitless. Like I could invent anything and everything because it truly was my own invented world. And so, of course, that came with the fun of writing fantasy. And it also came with like the pitfalls of having to set my own definitions versus historical gave me that. It gave me the cage to grow in.
Sure. No, I totally understand that. And having creative boundaries is really, really important. And historical fantasy
Mhm.
gives you those boundaries in many ways.
Mhm. Absolutely.
No, I can totally understand that. So we have a few questions from our lovely audience, and actually,
Ooh.
this kind of touches on what you've been talking about. So
Mm.
Bonnie Juju says, "How much historical detail is too much? Is the elven shoes rule still a factor?" So the elven
What is
shoes
that?
rule is yes, that's my fault. Um, so we talk about world builders disease here, which is the propensity
Mm.
people who enjoy creating fictional worlds, second worlds. We can get out of control. We can
Oh,
get
yeah.
really into the world building.
Mhm.
And so my rule is you have elves, they have some kind of footwear, great.
Mhm.
The footwear becomes relevant for something like somebody is identified by their footwear. At that point, you might need a few details about, okay, this guy wears this kind of footwear and this social class wears this kind of footwear. So if someone's
Mm.
wearing the wrong kind of footwear, it makes sense for your world. Okay, we have what we need to continue the story.
Mhm.
But if you write a 500-page treatise of elven shoes fashion through the ages and how it's changed, and it's illustrated, and there's a timeline, and there's a map, and then you've got world builder's disease.
Mhm.
That's how we talk about world builder's disease. So if you can
Mm.
use it for the story and it's still within the space of, okay, there's a reason for me knowing this, it's not
Mhm.
yet world builder's disease. The minute
Mhm.
you go into the 500-page treatise territory, honey, you got world builder's disease.
Yep.
I'm so
Yep.
sorry. Um, so the question here is, having explained what elven shoes are,
Mhm.
how much historical detail is too much, and at what point are you just writing a 500-page treatise about elven shoes?
I feel like it goes by the exact same rules. Like it becomes what would be like a term for that? Like maybe it's like the bowler hat rule or something like that, right? Like it's if it is critical to the story, it should be mentioned in a way that, I always think details in novels should do double duty of some way. You're never just telling us about the street because the street looks nice. You are also saying something about the way the character perceives the world or, the kind of like social distress that is going on or it's telling you something about how the families like on this street like treat their laundry lines or something like that, right? But any detail that is mentioned does more than just telling you about what is currently in front of the character. It is all something that ultimately feeds back to your understanding of the setting that you are in. So I feel like historical detail is the exact same. It's the syndrome I had when I was describing the battalions moving down the street, and my agent had to be like, "You either tell me how this is like relevant to your narrative, or unfortunately, this is going to get cut." And I sat there and I thought, okay, we will cut this because I just couldn't make it relevant, and that's okay. That sometimes it happens. That's the sad part of it's historical fantasy. It's not a historical textbook. It is about the story. It is not about everything that was happening at the time. As fascinating as it is, and as tempting as it is to include it, but I think authors have to be honest with themselves and ask them, do people really need to know this? And if it's yes, because it tells you something about the plot they're about to go into, great, keep it. If you're thinking, no, this is just to show off how I did the research and I want to use it, I'm so sorry. Get rid of it.
Yeah, I have definitely reading historical novels, I have definitely found passages where I feel like somebody's just copied something out of Wikipedia and pasted
Mhm.
it into the thing. And they may not have done that, but literally it feels like here is an exposition dump about a
Mhm.
detail because I have done my research.
Yes, yes. Sometimes you can feel that authors just really, really want someone to tell them, "Good job, you did your research well."
We're authors, we understand this. It's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, amazing question, Bonnie Juju, and a fantastic answer, Chloe. We have another one from Hugh Pierre, who asks, is there anything that can be done with the research stuff that couldn't be used? So your battalion of soldiers, for example,
Yeah.
is there anything you can do with the research, the knowledge, the good vibes that you had? You know, what happens to that after it ends up on the editing
On the cutting
floor?
board.
Yeah.
It just becomes a story I tell when I'm talking about historical world building now. Like, I do wish that there was some way to make it relevant, right? But I think when we say kill your darlings in storytelling, there's ultimately a reason for it. Like, you are acting for the good of that book, and cutting it should make it better. It shouldn't make it like different in some other way. It should improve the story ultimately. And so, I've tried to find opportunities where like it could make more sense later down the line, or it could make sense in a different story, maybe. But in the same way that ideas are limitless, there will always be new historical facts and research that you can use. And sometimes you are worse off for hanging on to an old thing that you couldn't make use of. Sometimes it really is just fun chatter at a dinner party when the conversation dies down.
Yeah, absolutely. And who knows? Maybe one of your future characters will be one of those soldiers, and then
Exactly.
you'll be able to
Exactly.
use it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay then. I think that brings me to my final question, which is, what advice would you give to someone considering in dabbling in historical fantasy for the
Mhm.
first time? People sitting here, they're thinking, "Oh, I'm in love with the time period X," or "I
Mm.
really want to write about," I don't know, somebody was mentioning a coffee shop in Pompeii.
I love
What is
that.
your advice, right?
Yeah.
Cozy Pompeii fantasy. It's all doomed, but let's have a croissant. I love this idea. So what advice would you give to somebody in that position?
Mhm. I feel like it would be the same advice to anyone thinking of starting a novel at all, which is just to start it. I think that is the scariest part of anything, and it's doubly scary for historical fantasy because you feel like you have to go in with so much prep. I think this is one of those genres where more than anything, you hear about writers who are doing like research after research. Like, I know people who have a historical fantasy idea, and for like months, they go to the library reading the books instead. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think before I started my first book, I went to the library, I sat myself down in front of the like 1920s China section, and I just flipped through everything, right? But there needs to be a point where you just do it. And it sounds so much easier when you say it like that. But I really feel like there's something debilitating about this like idea of going into a world so big, so involved in real facts, real narrative. But you can only fix something that already exists. You can write it wrong, you can get all the like structure in place, and the only thing right about it is maybe like the atmosphere. And then you can go in and like adjust, like, of course, don't do it so wrong that like you then need to change the entire story in order to make a historical fantasy. But I want to believe that anyone who already has a fascination with a time period knows enough about it that they can start. I believe that. I truly think at any point, if you're like, I love this time period, you probably know enough to at least get the structure of a story in. Start it, do your research, go from there, but don't let research be the thing that holds you back.
I think that is so, so wise. Get get informed, do the thing.
Yeah, yeah,
You can always fix it in post.
exactly.
Um, well, folks, you can go and check out Chloe's historical fantasy series and more on her website, the Chloe Gong. But Chloe, what's coming out next?
Next, actually, this is so funny for this topic. I have a YA futuristic sci-fi releasing next year, which
Oh,
is
wow.
great, right? I have spent my entire writing career writing historical fantasy and fantasy based on history. So this is my first foray into the future. It's been very fun because it almost feels like I'm flexing the same like historical research muscles, except I'm researching like our present in order to write a future that I feel is realistic. But then it also means I can write like text conversations. Like I have not gotten to use the words lol in any of my 1920 Shanghai stuff. So it's been lots of fun. It's called Cold Wire and it's coming out fall of 2025.
Very, very exciting. I do have some suggestions from the chat, by the way, who've
Ooh.
turned up in force about what to do with all of that extra research. This is what they're saying. They say they're great for reader extras.
Mm,
You can put them in your Substack or on your website. You can put them on
mhm.
your World Anvil page so that your fans can go and check them out. We have a lot of historical fantasy people who use World Anvil to curate their research. So they'll put like some bits of it up public, and then they'll just
Mm.
have it as like a giant searchable research Bible. So
Ooh.
yeah, lots of stuff that my amazing audience has come up with for stuff to do with all that extra research you don't know what
Yeah.
to do with. So hey, there we go. Well,
Lovely.
folks, just before we go, I actually have a little announcement for you. So this is new information, but a bunch of you guys came to us and said, we would like to write a novel in November, and we would like a place to do that. We would like a community to do that with. And I said, okay, we will do that. So we are providing a space in November. We are calling it Novelember. It's like November with the L
Ooh.
in the middle. Novelember. We will be running that over November. It will be self-reported. It's a challenge, not competition. You can come and take part. You can get a digital badge if you participate. You can get a digital badge if you win, and you can also download a certificate for yourself if you would like to. It is entirely in the spirit of love and yays and supporting each other. I'm not looking to throw any shade. I just know a lot of writers would like a space, so I have provided a space. So just to let you know, we will be releasing more information on this later on, but in general, 50,000 words or editing, or if you're a GM, do that. Be a rebel. I don't mind. Do something that's useful for you. Hooray! Have fun. Hashtag Novelember. That's the plan. So
That's so fun.
just to let you guys know, because a bunch of you had come to us, I got DMs about this, I got emails about this of kind of like, I would like to do something in November, and the place that I usually do that, I'm not doing that anymore. So there you are. If you would like to join us, traditionally we haven't done something in November for that reason, but this year, okay, you asked us, we will run a thing. So just a heads up, that is happening, be aware. And in 10 minutes over on the YouTube, which is where we're going now, we are releasing a video on the Tiffany problem. So yes, if you have found yourself researching and come across ancient Greek pump activated fire hoses, or Greek or Roman vending machines, or
Mhm.
uh, discovered that Chad is in fact a historical name, and you don't know what to do about this, then I have some tips for you on how to come across that, how to deal with that, and all of those things. That's going to be in 10 minutes over on the
Love
YouTube. We're
it.
going there directly after this. The chat will be hot. The lols will be real. There, we say the word lols. We're not in the history anymore.
LOL has been invented in our timeline.
Lol has been invented. Also, yeet.
Mm,
Yes. All right,
yeah.
Chloe, I want to thank you so, so much for not just being an amazing and informed guest, but a wonderful conversation partner. Thank you
Oh,
so very much.
thank you for having me. This has been such a great chat. I love talking historical fantasy.
Me too. Me too. I could nerd out about it all day, and this has been so, so enjoyable. Folks, I will see you over on the YouTube. Secondhand Samurai is going to get you there. He's going to be showing the links now. Biggest love to you all. Grab your hammer and go world build. See you soon, guys.